First, why don't you start by just telling us what an open internet means to you and how that's different from the platforms that we all know and use so often?
Yeah, excuse me. I believe it's a fundamental human right. So as more and more of our lives come to be sort of governed by technology and we rely on it more and more, I think it's so important that we can see how that technology works and modify it. And that's really, to me, what's at the core of the open internet. It's also the idea that anyone can innovate without asking permission. And that was what has made the web great and so resilient over the past 30 years.
So, big Twitter debate on this. Earlier this month, Jack Dorsey ignited that heated discussion by saying that it's not actually users at the end of the day, but the VCs that fund the new generation of Web3 companies that own it. Do you agree with that? And I wonder, in Automattic's case, you've been able to retain voting power while raising money from VCs and other investors. So does that mean, though, that the power is concentrated with you versus decentralized, what you're sort of fighting for?
Yeah, I haven't spoken to Jack about that, so all I know is his tweets about it as well. If you look at 7 of the top 10 top companies by capitalization, they were funded by venture capitalists. So we've also been funded by VCs over the years, and they've been fantastic long-term partners. In the early days, VCs had a worse reputation, which is why I focus so much on retaining voting control and things like that. But to be honest, if you're growing and the business is doing well, they typically try to leave you alone. So I would say that any entrepreneur who's really worried about that, just focus on your business and growing as much as possible. And probably your investors will be pretty happy and as supportive as possible.
But in your case, Matt, I just wonder, how do you get away from this concept of centralization? If you are fighting for a decentralized web, but you are retaining voting control, how does that sort of fulfill that ethos?
Yeah, well, I run a company called Automattic, which is very centralized, as you said, like I'm the CEO of that company now. But we make software for decentralization. So it's kind of about user choice versus, I guess, investor and employee's choice. So if you're an investor or employee of Automattic, you're kind of signing up to be on this train that we're all on together. But if you're a user of our software, you have complete freedom. You could search and replace the software from WordPress to CNBC Press and sell your own version. You could modify it. You could publish things that we don't like. You could do pretty much anything about it because the software has a bill of rights attached. It's the open source license, which allows anyone to use and modify the software for any purpose.
Matt, I have 2 questions for you. First is, are you calling from your RV? This great protocol piece talked about how you have built this fancy high-tech RV, and it does not look like you're in an RV.
No, I'm not in the RV today. I'm visiting my mom, so I'm in a more stable location.
All right. And so the second question I have, and I want to read a quote from this great protocol piece, which is, as more and more of our lives start to be run and dictated by technology use, it's a human right to be able to see how that technology works and modify it. And so many of the tech giants have said, do not do that, right? We've had issues with getting transparency into algorithms, into how the gadgets are made. How does this get forced? Is this a legislation thing? Is this just a cultural thing?
I think there's a place for legislation because many of these companies are as large or larger than most countries or governments. So we might need sort of, the will of the people driving elected officials to drive some change here. I would say particularly around interoperability. Typically, these companies will interoperate in their early days, and then once they're successful, kind of pull up the ladder behind it. So if you think the first version of iMessage and Google Talk and other messaging platforms was built on an open standard called XMPP. And now, of course, they're all very proprietary, and you have to use 10 different messaging apps because none of them talk to each other. On the other side, though, I think the most important thing is just user and consumer will and behavior. So when people vote with their wallets and with their personal choices, both in, we talked earlier about who they elect, but I think even more importantly is what software they use, where they spend their dollars, what companies they support, who they work for. That's what ultimately drives the most change in the world. And so that's why a big part of what I do, in addition to my day job of creating, WordPress and Tumblr and Jetpack and WooCommerce, is try to evangelize for this philosophy, because it is a way of understanding and looking at things, not unlike the philosophies that sort of drove the Enlightenment or the creation of modern democracies. It's a way of saying, yeah, that there's a default for how the world could happen, but we want something more. We're going to work a little bit harder to maintain our freedom and autonomy, both for ourselves and future generations.